Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus. I'm Washington State government reporter for the Center Square, Carlene Johnson. And joining me right now is Tim Clouser, who covers Spokane and much of Eastern Washington for all of us. And he's been covering an exclusive series of articles about the city of Spokane preparing to part ways with Spokane Regional Emergency Communications, basically their 911 service. But now SREC is asking for some time, it sounds like, Tim, to maybe clear up confusion about the split, which is set for January, if I'm not mistaken, even as the city says this thing isn't going to be ready to launch come January. So what's the latest in this exclusive coverage coming from you, Tim?
Yeah, so last week the city council had a committee meeting, and they essentially talked about their upcoming transition to a new dispatch center. They've used the regional model the last few years. The Spokane Fire Department has. The Spokane Police Department has its own smaller dispatch center, so it never fully joined, despite Shrek's demands over the years. But essentially, earlier in the year, the Shrek board voted to remove the city from the regional model after the city had asked its state lawmakers to claw back funding that it had paid Shrek for years of services. When they had this sort of update during the committee meeting last week, Shrek wasn't even there. The spokesman review had reported on the meeting right after the fact and had accidentally referenced that Shrek officials were there and had spoken, but that wasn't the case. But essentially, this meeting was a follow-up to our coverage. In the days leading up to that meeting, I had gotten a hold of a feasibility study that essentially showed that 3 months before the city's supposed to transition to this new dispatch center, they realized that it would cost almost $100 million in the first 5 years before inflation. And the consultants also told the city, look, usually you want 18 to 24 months to do this. And the city said, look, we need to do it in 14 months at a minimum. So they said they could do it contingent upon several assumptions that every single one has to hold true for them to hit that 14-month timeline for launch. But at the same time, we're only 3 months away from January 2026 when the city's supposed to have its new dispatch center set up. And Shrek says the city hasn't even reached out about which services it wants to contract through next year as it's sort of in the middle of this transition. So after the spokesman ran its article following up to our coverage and that committee meeting, Shrek was pretty upset and wanted to clear the air, address several inaccuracies that they thought were stated during the meeting and in the spokesman article. So last Friday, the Shrek board of directors sent a letter to the city saying, look, essentially, this is your fault. If you want clarity, then you need to invite us to the table. You guys have another committee meeting on October 6th. We would like to be on the agenda for 10 or 20 minutes so we can tell you what you guys need. So,
and remind me how it works now. If someone in the city of Spokane, needs to call 911, are those calls already redirected? Fire call, police call, whatever the crisis call is being made?
Yeah, so essentially almost every fire and police agency in Spokane County participate in Shrek. So they pay dues, they contribute tax revenue to get these services. So no matter where you are in Spokane County, if you call 911, Shrek dispatchers are going to answer the phone. Now, if it's a fire call in the city, Shrek is going to answer the call and dispatch units to that incident. Now, since SPD has its own secondary PSAP, public safety answering point, Shrek still answers the initial phone call and they say, hold on, we'll transfer you to SPD. And they hit one button and the call transfers. It's not like they have to look up the number, hit every digit and wait on hold. It's just an instant transfer. So whether you're in Meade, Airway Heights, over near the airport or other parts of Spokane, Shrek always answers the phone. Now, come January 2026, Shrek told the city, look, we're willing to maybe contract out some services, like you can use our radio towers and stuff, but there won't be extensions in terms of dispatching. Now, that doesn't mean that the calls are going to go unanswered. Essentially, come New Year's Day, whenever someone within the city calls about a fire incident, Shrek will still answer the phone. But rather than dispatching units directly to that incident, they're going to again transfer that call to SBD instead of just dispatching like they have done in the past and currently do. So, the city's concerned that there might be some delays to service. Shrek saying, look, you already have a dispatch center there and you had months to prepare for this. So they're saying it's pretty much in the city's hands at this point.
Yeah, well, so what happened? I mean, why has the city convinced itself or told taxpayers they think they can do this cheaper, more effectively? Response times will go down. I mean, what's the impetus for the split with Shrek?
Well, I know a few years in the past, there was concerns over the transfer between calls. I know a few times people kind of got hung up in between dispatchers. And I know a few years ago, the city went to the state legislature and tried to get some of the tax revenue it was contributing to the regional model. It was trying to get those dollars to come directly to the city. So it could just pay Shrek, or it could go a different way in the future if it wanted. Now, there's multiple different branches to Shrek's funding model. There's member fees that each agency pays, a sales tax, 0.1% sales tax that voters approved in 2017. And then there's the state's 911 excise tax. So whenever someone calls 911, they pay this tax that's a few cents, and then that money goes directly to the county. Now, the city asked the state legislature a few months ago to, instead of sending that money directly to the county, that the county should split that revenue up. And when it did that, Shrek said, look, we can tell what you're doing. You're trying to take the revenue and walk away. And the city makes up almost half of all the calls that Shrek receives in dispatches. So it's a big deal to them. It's a lot of funding. So when the city did that, Shrek pretty much waved goodbye and voted to kick the city out. And then as that bill kind of went through the state legislature, they were going back and forth trying to get a compromise. The state passed a bill saying that the county had to split up that revenue, which they're in the process of trying to figure out how to do that. But it's just been a lot of back and forth and just kind of constant turmoil between these two partners.
And you asked the communications person, I saw that in your article, about the transmission towers, because that's the first thing I thought of. I'm like, well, somebody paid for those, to go in so that real time connection can happen when there's an emergency. So right now, does the city 3 months from now going to be prepared with their own towers? They're going to have to rent those from Shrek, or what's the plan?
So that's what we'll probably find out during next week. Councilmember Zach Chapone, who chairs the Public Safety and Community Health Committee, he told me that he will likely accept Shrek's pleas to be on the agenda for that day. So Shrek will kind of lay out what the city might need moving forward. But when I asked Shrek and I said, look, you mentioned there's a possibility that they could contract some services, what would those be? And the first example they brought up was those radio towers, because Shrek has, I believe, 10 to 20 something radio towers scattered around the county. And that's not just something that the city could instantly stand up in the next 3 months. That would be a huge undertaking, not to mention it would cost millions of dollars.
They already can't afford this whole thing, right? That's a bunch more.
But it's not just the towers too. Like, you think those towers communicate with Shrek's radio system, and that radio system is in every single police car in the city and every single fire unit. So it's not like the city can just say, oh, well, now it's going to our system. They have to put that system in. So all these police cars in the city are already connected with Shrek. So in terms of efficiency, if the city is going to take 14, 18 to 24 months to stand up its PSAP, it's probably in the best interest of tax dollars and just response times to keep those systems in place, at least in the interim, until you're able to afford and build up your own. That way, calls aren't taking longer to respond to.
Is there any sense at this point that the city will just say, you know what, we're not going to be ready to go come January 1. We probably can't afford what we promised we could do. Can we please reconcile? Is there any room left for that to happen?
No, not really. There's not room for that. So essentially, behind the scenes, behind all of this, Shrek has been it purchased and is currently implementing a new computer-aided dispatch system, also called a CAD system. So they purchased this, I believe, a few months ago, and that new CAD system will go live in March. Now, this takes a lot of time and money to build up, and they have to do it specific to all these agencies that are participating in SHREC. And that's one of the reasons that SHREC wanted SPD to commit along with the fire department, because it had to build out this new dispatch system for all the agencies that are participating. And the city's been back and forth the last few years. So they said pretty much the city needs to join or it needs to leave. And when it kind of got to those final stages, and they said, look, we're going to move forward with this CAD system. If you don't commit, you won't be a part of it, and we won't be able to dispatch you come when it's implemented in March. The city and SHREC waved goodbye, and now they're splitting ways. So that's why SHREC is saying it's going to reroute calls come January, because its new CAD system isn't set up for the city. So at this point, it's just going to have to reroute those calls. Now, when the city stands up its CAD system, it's going to be almost identical to SHREC. So they said there might be a possibility where they could, somehow pair the systems, I believe, so they can more easily switch calls if that's needed. But SHREC will continue to answer all 911 calls until the state says the city's primary PSAP is ready. You can now set it up so when someone calls 911 within the city's PSAP will answer the call, not SHREC. Now, there might be some issues where in some instances, someone in the city calls 911 and it still goes to SHREC. But that already happens with, say, like Kootenai County in Idaho. It borders Spokane County. Sometimes people near the fringe, they'll call 911 and it's for some reason goes to SHREC, and then they hit the button and transfer it. So there will still be some cases like that. But come January, SHREC will begin rerouting those calls.
And of course, the bottom line for Joe Public having an emergency and needing to call is this going to delay? Because, when you're the person, if you've ever had to call 911, when you're the person that is, hang on, I'll transfer your call. That's the last thing you want to hear in that moment of crisis, whether you're calling from a car crash or, somebody fell, whatever. The response time is critical.
A slew of new taxes about to hit Washington residents as part of the largest tax increase in state history that was signed into law just a few months ago. Carlene, why don't you run our readers through the taxes that are about to hit them and business owners and how this is all playing out?
I think the list of what isn't now being taxed or taxed at a larger percentage is shorter than if I went through all of it. I mean, it's getting to the point where it is nearly impossible to figure out what is and isn't taxed. But you're right. This was part of the package that was signed by Governor Ferguson at the conclusion of the 2025 legislative session. And some of those things took effect immediately. Some taxes kicked in on July the 1st, and the rest of them kicked in Thursday of this week, the first day of the last quarter. And I was thinking, Tim, I should have actually put a headline on my article that published on Tuesday saying, the final quarter of the year might bring you down to your final quarter in your wallet, because that's what, I'll hit on a couple of the big ones. This was under Senate Bill 5814, which is part of the tax package for the operating budget, but wide range of business services that were not subject to sales tax now are. So advertising services, including things that are online and digital ads, custom software, custom website development. So before you could say you're trying to come up with, a website for your little tiny startup company, that was something that was not subject to paying sales tax before, but now is. Data processing, data entry, IT services, whether it's network support or training. I'm thinking of, I've had to get IT support because I'm no techno genius. So having IT support, whether it's, having those services or somebody takes over your computer that teaches you how to troubleshoot something, that now in the state of Washington is subject to sales tax, which means our company will have to pay more, right, for any services provided here. Security, armored car services, And this is the confusing part, Tim, something called live presentations. So training, seminars, maybe a senior center brings in somebody to do a presentation and the folks that are coming there to take the class for CPR or something else. All of that now is subject to higher taxes as of October the 1st.
Yeah, interesting. And this comes in addition to a slew of other taxes on products, fee increases to hunting licenses and other things like this that are
you covered that one extensively. That one's hitting people. That one did not please a lot of people. I remember when you wrote about that, that story got a ton of traction. But yeah, everything they can tax and fee increase, they've done.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I know the legislature, particularly the Democrat majority, they push these tax increases. A lot of them are saying, look, these aren't taxes on residents or consumers so much. These are the taxes on the businesses that are doing this work. And that's kind of the same argument that, or what's being played out is kind of the same argument we've heard with the tariffs, is that it's a second tax. It's something that's passed on consumers. Can you kind of speak to that? And then how, while these taxes are technically on the businesses operating these services, that those costs are passed down?
Absolutely. That you're right. They framed the entire argument during hearings that took place in the last couple of days of session around this is going to be a tax on large corporations, because they did increase B&O taxes as well on the largest corporations in the state. That's not going to hurt, Joe Public. He's going to be good. But you're right. All of it gets passed on to us. So if the company that you and I work for has an IT service, that now in the state of Washington say that they need to take over our computer and help us online. Well, ultimately, that's going to affect the company, right? Because they have to pay a higher tax for that. So does that mean then that employees don't get a salary increase that was promised? Now, I use our company as an example, but you understand this ultimately, whether it affects the employees of these companies that are paying higher taxes or the consumer on the other end for that service. We're all feeling it. Just like they say that with the tariffs, that same argument. Oh, it's not going to be that. It's, but we know it trickles down to us because the higher gas prices, well, it costs more to get those goods to market. And so broccoli in the grocery store costs, 50% more than it did 2 years ago. There isn't any way that it doesn't impact the consumer on our end, whether that's the service that we're paying for, the company that we're working for, or just, out in the marketplace. It is all having a huge impact. And one of the things I wrote about in my article, which was significant, is the Department of Revenue. Boy, they have had to scramble on this to educate, business service sectors that are impacted, and they didn't have it figured out. And usually when you're writing budgets and, you've got your budget leads during session that are coming up with this stuff, they go to the Department of Revenue and say, okay, this is what we're thinking about doing. We're going to tax now, armored car services. So reach out to them, find out what the impact could be. And then they can come back to budget writers and staff support and say, by the way, these armored car guys say this is going to crush, them. We can't do this. Maybe we should exempt them or continue to exempt them. They didn't have time because the budgets were not revealed until the final days of session. Department of Revenue had zero time to do any of that homework and consult with affected industry. And so it's been, since it was already signed into law, they've had to have all these listening sessions and provide guidance. And even this week, as the taxes were kicking in, there is still a ton of confusion. Department of Revenue is still unsure. So there's going to be taxes that need to be collected that aren't, or maybe taxes that are collected improperly that then have to then what? Do you go back to the consumer and say, I owe you a refund? There's so much confusion, Tim.
Yeah, and in some of these cases, it's going to be too late to come back after the fact and say, oh, no, we're sorry how this impacted your business. Let's try to help, because it's not just major corporations that these are hitting, like you spoke to. I mean, this is going to hit mom and pop shops as well. And I believe your article mentioned a recent survey with hundreds of responses that kind of got into that as well.
Yeah, it was, I mean, Department of Revenue, neutral, right? Supposed to just say, okay, we're not supporting or not supporting these taxes. We're just going to have these listening sessions, get feedback from the businesses that are impacted. And there was so much frustration, so much anxiety. And a lot of the businesses that took part in these listening sessions and gave their feedback to the Department of Revenue said, this will be the final straw for us. And I interviewed, Senator Drew McCune, who is in the, represents the Shelton area. He said there's already so much tax burden. He had a Democrat business owner. He's a conservative, but he had a Democrat business owner that reached out to him and said, is this really what's coming come Wednesday, the 1st of October? Is this really the increase on my business? And he said, he thought he probably wouldn't survive and have to buckle under it. Whether, like you said, he's somebody that's a small business that maybe provides IT services or advertising services just online, maybe has a handful of customers. Because remember, if you as the business owner decide I'm going to absorb this because I already am struggling to keep the clients I've got, maybe they can, maybe they can't, but they're also afraid to pass that on to their clients, their customers, for fear that then they're going to lose that business. So many of them are just stuck right now, and it's going to take months of writing this out to figure out what the true impact is.
Mm-hmm. It's really interesting to see the legislature pass this historic tax increase to close its own $12 to $16 billion budget deficit. Now it's facing another budget deficit ahead of the next session, so they might have to raise taxes again. But at the same time, when they were looking at how to solve this budget deficit before, a lot of progressives were saying, oh, we'll pass a wealth tax. And Ferguson said, no, we don't want to do that, because if it gets injuncted in court, then it's going to blow a hole in our budget. But at the same time, you have a huge corporation like Comcast who is now suing the state over this tax plan anyway. So if this law is injuncted, it's going to blow a hole in their budget. That's a hugely important point. And there are already folks from both parties, but I've spoken to several Republicans who are budget leads who have said the very same thing. If this thing gets tossed out, or even just that chunk of it gets tossed out and it blows a bigger hole in the budget, we're already you've seen the latest revenue forecast that just came out, in September. Another $900 million, gap over the next 4 years. So they're already talking about having to increase taxes again. That's going to go over like a lead balloon. I mean, there isn't, what else do we tax? Who else do we increase taxes on? And the burden, the increased burden on large corporations that are already paying such a huge, sales tax, B&O taxes, property taxes for their buildings, employee taxes for them that have gone up. If these guys decide to pull out over this, the Jeff Bezoses of the world that leave, then, we're sunk even further. So this next legislative session is going to be a show. Yeah. And it's not just Jeff Bezos. Microsoft is right there with them and pushing back against these tax increases. But definitely something we'll keep our eyes on as we move into the next session this fall and winter. Carlene. Send me into fits talking about the next session coming so soon.
We're talking today about a recent article of yours on debates continuing within the Washington State Attorney General's Office of Domestic Extremism and Mass Violence Task Force. That's a mouthful, but basically what they're talking about is what constitutes domestic violence extremism, and if it includes legally protected speech and activities. So let's just start off here with you maybe just briefly describing what is going on with the task force currently. What are they discussing and where are they at right now?
I think that might be a good question to ask. It's a good question to ask based on the meeting, the most recent one, because the premise of this task force is to have people get together and talk about how do you prevent violence that comes from what they call domestic violent extremism and treat it from a public health perspective. And there's so many problems with this that's becoming really readily apparent because one, you're trying to treat protected speech and activities like it's a public health risk, which has so many First Amendment implications of going after certain people or groups. And then the other issues, they talk about mass shootings. Well, domestic violent extremism, who gets to it goes to what is that? And the Walla sheriff, as he pointed out during the most recent meeting, you cannot define it because it's going to involve legally protected First Amendment speech and activities, and people are going to sue. That's what's going to happen if the government starts treating certain people, certain ideologies, certain groups, certain thoughts, certain beliefs, certain religious convictions as a public health risk to be targeted for, treatment. You understand the problems with that. But what was so weird about the most recent meeting is they had a constitutional expert go through the history of the Second Amendment and talk about how the government, how paramilitaries and militias, like private militias and private paramilitaries are illegal, always have been. They're not authorized. They're illegal in Washington state, I believe. So it's all government stuff. But then they got onto this topic of ICE agents wearing masks for fear of doxing and being, having violence against them. And this was occurring the same day as ICE agents were having protesters say, kill them, shoot them to their faces, right? At these rallies and protest riots, whatever you want to call them. And the constitutional expert basically it was her personal opinion, but she said, if ICE agents have done nothing wrong, they have no reason to hide their face. And my question is, what does that have to do with domestic violent extremism? They're now talking about restrictions on law enforcement, and I don't understand what that has to do. It was such a weird meeting because it really didn't get to the issue of what domestic violent extremism is and how to treat it from a public health perspective. And it was so funny to listen to them discuss, because there were other topics, but they were talking about restrictions on, individuals owning firearms or having militaries, but then they go over to talking about restrictions on law enforcement. So it's guys, you kind of have to, it's like the stance changes based on the context. So it was I would encourage people to go watch the meeting and ask yourself, why are they discussing these issues?
It's, to start off, it's just interesting. It's unique to see the task force approach domestic violence extremism from a public health perspective. Now, were they all in agreement on that, or did some task force members say maybe we should approach this from a purely law enforcement perspective? Was that something that they even considered? Because we're talking about the Second Amendment.
Yeah, that's exactly what the Walla sheriff said. He just said, let's treat it from a criminal perspective. Did someone break the law? Okay, then they should be prosecuted, have charges filed against them. They should be punished. If someone is engaging in peaceful First Amendment, Second Amendment protected activity, you can't go after them as the government. And so he, cuts through a lot of this and just says, is it illegal or not legal? Or sorry, is it legal or illegal? That's the only thing that the government should be looking at. They shouldn't be looking at beliefs and ideologies. That's not the place of the government. And that's also not the place for law enforcement to say, and we're seeing this with the ballot initiative signature gatherers, where you have people calling 911 and saying, there was one guy who called 911 and said, these signature gatherers are taking a politically charged stance. It's guys, the First Amendment is not there so that we can talk about the weather or about the Packers versus the Patriots, which team are you rooting for the Super Bowl? It's so that people can talk about very controversial ideas and not be afraid of having the government break into their home and drag them out and throw them in jail, or having people violently attack them in the street. That's the whole point of the First Amendment, is so that we can talk about controversial ideas, have them debated, and have them discussed. And so what was also interesting is, you think that they would be having reflections on how this whole definition of domestic violent extremism can lead to people thinking it is okay to commit acts of violence against people for engaging in First Amendment or Second Amendment protected activity, which we've seen in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, where people think it's perfectly acceptable to kill people for saying things that you don't like. And using the term, let's also be frank, let's not be also naive. Domestic violent extremism is a term intended to make people equate it with domestic violence. Like, oh, it's a wife beater. It's a guy who beats his wife. Like, we're going to equate them with the same thing as someone who holds beliefs that we don't want to accept. And this whole public health thing is, many people would argue, is a way of them trying to get around the First Amendment and saying, well, we can't throw you in jail, but we can treat you like you have a disease. You know, it's a very passive aggressive, indirect way of going after people. You know, it's almost like, you know, are they going to have government agents show up at your door and say, we're not here to arrest you, but we have to, God forbid they get to the point where they start quarantining people, saying, you know, you have political disease, you know, and it's going to spread and it's going to infect everybody. So we've got to quarantine and we've got to impose all these restrictions on you. But it's not because of the First Amendment. It's because you have a disease, an ideological disease or something like that. I'm not saying they're going to do that. I treat it from a public health perspective. How is that scientific? Like, public health is supposed to be dealing with things like actual physical diseases or viruses or plagues or things that can cause physical health ailments. And I understand that people can argue that the psychological, mental impacts of stuff, but at the same time, we go back to the First Amendment. If somebody can claim that somebody else's ideology or speech is causing them physical harm, that same person can turn around and say, well, your beliefs are causing me harm. So where does that get us?
Yeah. And, you know, that's what came to my mind. We're talking about a public health perspective is, I suppose there is some kind of psychology to consider. But I think to make that the focus here is kind of eye-opening and questionable. But one other thing, TJ, is this whole conversation that happened, it veered into whether ICE agents should wear masks to protect identities, which you touched on earlier. Now, what prompted this tangent? And I mean, how does this connect back to the core focus of domestic violence extremism?
Right. I mean, well, they're trying, I feel like they're trying to thread this needle. They're trying to stick a square box in a round peg, where they're trying to say, on one hand, they're trying to discuss how individuals are restricted when it comes to owning firearms and exercising their rights, and how law enforcement should be how the government has all these privileges of like organizing National Guard and federal enforcement and police and all that kind of stuff. But then you go over to the other side of like, oh, but that means that they have powers over citizens and have the ability to do things that they can't. Then it gets into this weird, like, I feel like there's this kind of, I don't want to use the term two-faced, but it's like on one hand, I don't know. It's a very interesting discussion, because I think what we're seeing is this dichotomy of agendas of like, you see people, for example, what wasn't really emphasized during this discussion is, you know, the constitutional scholar was talking about the Second Amendment, which is in the United States Constitution. But Washington State's Constitution has enshrined in its Bill of Rights a individual right to keep and bear arms. So, and yet we have all these restrictions in our state on gun ownership. Like, certain guns are banned, and you have to be a certain age and above the age of 18, and and they're putting all these restrictions on gun stores. If we had a right to, say, abortion enshrined in our Constitution, I don't think anybody would argue that they would just say, you cannot pass any laws restricting abortion in any way, shape, or form of any kind. Shall not be infringed. You know, that's the end of it. Instead, what we have is, even though it's not in the Constitution, we have our state funding and buying up abortion medication. So it's just interesting that the scholar didn't really mention that, because, yeah, the Second Amendment is an application at the federal level, but we have our own protection of the right to keep and bear arms. And so I feel like it goes back to what the Walla sheriff said, where he just kind of got to the heart of the issue. Is it legal or not legal? if it's a crime and if somebody commits a crime and engages in violence, then we prosecute them. But going after people or targeting or focusing or emphasizing people who have views that we don't agree with, and it goes back to how you can't define domestic violent extremism, because I guarantee you somebody will sue the state over this, and it's going to go to the Supreme Court of the United States, and they're going to say, you can't do this. This is First Amendment protected speech, and the state cannot use public resources to undermine legally protected speech, people who are engaging in lawful activities, who are engaging in protests or rallies. That's the whole point, to petition the government for the redress of grievances. You can't say, well, they're extremists and we're going to treat them like a disease.
Yeah, and that's where it all gets murky here, right? What we're talking about. But the task force has some time to explore this more. I think the final report is due December of next year. So
yeah, they have to also come up with a charter, and they at some point they're going to have to define domestic violent extremism. And I think what will inevitably happen is they're either going to do one or two things. They're going to play it safe, and they're going to go with a definition that only includes illegal activity, or they're going to go with something that includes lawful activity, and you're going to have civil rights groups suing, saying, hey, if we fall under that definition, we're going to be targeted by the state and treated different. Yeah. I feel like it's going to lead to some very, very interesting conversations with this task force, where people are trying to avoid something that they cannot avoid. They want to include behavior, speech, ideologies that they don't like, but they know that there will be consequences if they do. And it's going to be legal, and it's going to also make it official. Like once you have a Supreme Court ruling on the issue, people can ignore it depending on the situation. But once the precedent's been set, it's really difficult for you to get around that, and people can cite that. It's now on the books. So the next couple of meetings, including the one coming up in January, is going to be very fascinating to watch, because they're going to have to come to terms with this within the next year and figure out what they're going to do.
Right. And that meeting coming up is on January 9th. And I know, TJ, you'll keep an eye on that and keep us posted. So appreciate you taking the time to talk about this, and looking forward to your continued coverage. This is Spencer Pauly. Until then, thanks for watching.